So thanks for jumping on today, everybody. It's July, so we could sit here for the next hour and talk about where we went on vacation or where we wish we went on vacation, or Peterson could talk about what marathons he's ran, things like that. But we'll save that for the chat. Um, if you're watching this back, appreciate you guys watching and taking the time to pause out on it. We're going to do a couple things today a little differently. One of the things that I want to tee up before, and then I'm going to throw to Kay, is uh, we want to do something that we're calling pressure points. We've done a little bit of this before, but we're going to do it again today, and it's going to involve you being a little bit more involved in preemptively kind of letting us know where you're at. So before the end of the call, we're going to spend probably the last half of it maybe just group thinking some stuff that is going on with you. So we want to tee that up because we're going to talk a little bit about some other stuff to start. But if you wouldn't mind, think about where you're at right now. You're in July, into July. You're starting to think about fall. I know many of you did the Fab Five from the fall that we talked about last month. I got some text back from that, or we did. But be thinking about what's a major pressure point or two that you're feeling right now, and you can be as specific as possible. That would help us help. Like if you're thinking, man, I've got a group here that's completely safe. Let me talk about this. Maybe there's people that have been down that. Maybe there's people that have some perspective that I don't have. We will pull some of those in the last half of the call from the chat and try to attack them. So yeah, that one, Lynn, yeah, exactly. So go ahead and dump them in there, and Kay will kind of collect them there, and then we'll hit that a little bit before the end of the call. And please don't be afraid. Don't be like, yeah, mine doesn't matter. No, yours matters. So whatever it is, it matters. So don't be don't be shy on it. Just let us know how we can help you out. Okay. Let me screen share here, and then I'm going to throw it to Kay to talk a little bit about Think Tank Live and where we are. Kay, you want to take that real quick?
Yeah, you got the screen.
I'm working on it.
Okay, got it. Yeah, we would love for you guys to join us for the Think Tank Live. Basically, what happened was is that we used to do these calls. We have been doing these calls on a monthly basis, literally since 2020, for 4 years straight. And as we started doing that, people building community and those things, we wanted to actually get together in person. And so we've been doing the Think Tank Live for the last 3 years, and it's been growing every year, and we're on pace to even be larger than even the previous years. And so we would love for you to consider coming. The topic is really interesting. I mean, just the landscape of just ministry and leaders and all those type of things. What people are navigating from an anxiety perspective to leadership perspective. And so we've got Steve Cuss that's coming, talking a little bit about the managing the expectations and the anxieties of leadership. We've also got James Robertson from Brooklyn, New York. He's going to be doing a great session for us on the first night, as well as some other people that we know that is going to provide some value for you in this season. So the other thing that we're going to do this year that we haven't done before is some breakout stuff, because there's certain things that certain people are interested in and other people are not. And so you'd be able to choose some of those things as well. And so that information will be coming out a little bit later. And so just go to that website, growmentumgroup.ttl, and it's a very affordable, probably the cheapest conference that you'll ever register for, and maybe just the excuse to get out to Vegas. So that's Think Tank Live.
Love it. Love it. We hope you
Yeah, the
guys
next
can make it. We hope you guys can make it. We've got a heavy registrations already. Some of you guys are messing around. My only encouragement, and then I'm going to throw to Snod, would be stuff arrangements in Vegas. Being on the ground here can be tough. So if you're sure you're coming, I would really encourage you. If you're that like I'm going to book a hotel room or a flight 3 weeks before, that's going to be a mistake. So if you're coming, get on it because we want to see you guys here. Okay, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, the next thing I would love to do, which I don't even know that Lee, you're fully aware that I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna hey recommend the book that Lee wrote. I know he's gonna hate this plug, but you're gonna deal with it for just a minute. This book, I've been reading it lately. It's been really encouraging. I even see in the th in our chat here some of the staffing stuff that just keeps coming up as some of the pressure points. The thing I love about this book, just two just quick stories. My dad's an engineer, grew up in the church. He didn't really know how to use his gifting in the church. Secondly, how many times do we have guys in our church, high capacity people that don't know how to use their gifting in the church? The thing I'm loving about this book so far is helping those people realize that they have a place in the church. And so to me, it's going to be a great point of conversation of how we can tie it into some of our conversation today. But if you haven't, just honestly, I'd encourage you to check that book out. But I think it's going to be a great conversation. Look, Mark, he's got your book. You loving it
Mark,
as well.
Mark, come on,
But
baby.
come on, Mark Lee. Don't be afraid to be shy and talking here. But no, really, check that book out. Great opportunity there. But also, it's going to be a great tie into some of our pressure points today of some of the things that are going on. So just wanted to encourage that as we continue to jump in today.
One of the backgrounds on that I wanted to share, and I knew Jeff was going to talk a little bit about it, is it's also potentially, I think Donnie has dove into it a little bit. I think I'll just tell you guys the motivation really behind it is, and it morphed a little bit, but some of you guys have met some of, if you've been at Think Tank, you've met live in Vegas, you've met some of the high capacity guys that support Grow Minimum and support us. All of you guys on this call, I trust, have high capacity people, businessmen, businesswomen, leaders in, and then sometimes I think we struggle in the reality of like engaging them, right? Like we work with Rob in San Francisco. He's got some people on his elders that are like, man, they're out there, they're in it every day in a big way. And he has to figure out how to navigate that, right? And I think sometimes as church leaders, we tend to gather a lot of easy followers. I think we because we need doers, so we'll gather people that find a lot of value, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think that there are ways in which being part of the church community is healthy for some of those people. At the same time, I think we often struggle to figure out how to leverage people who, on their day to day lives, are really kind of changing the world and are pretty aggressive. And so, the motivation behind the book, as it kind of came together, was to speak to those people. I actually gave it to some of those guys to help them. So it hits a number of different facets of that, but that's why the subtitle, you guys, is so important. That idea of giving some of these folks, and these folks are also on your team, permission to live and lead loud and large, like not trying to stop them. The example I use, and then I'll shut up, is, a lot of times in the church we push, quiet and meditation and prayer, and those things are important, please. Like a lot of that kind of stuff. I like to phrase it this way: like, we love to tell somebody when they come to Jesus, be like the Apostle John, like lay your head on Jesus' shoulder, be quiet. And then there's people that's just not how they're wired, right? They want to know, now that I'm a person of faith, how do I go after it? What does that look like? And so Peter's kind of the patron saint of that, of kind of that guy that, did a lot of things that you would kind of go, what are you doing? At the same time, he was chosen to lead this movement that we now lead a part of in our context. So that's a pretty, pretty, pretty big deal. And so that's the motivation behind all of that, and what was behind writing that. It's also designed a little bit for teams. So if you guys have teams, there are some key takeaways. If you're one of those that likes to give your team a book for a couple months, have some conversations, I hope and trust that it might be helpful if you are that person. So if you are Mark Lee and you're like, crazy man, maybe your team needs to read about that, right? Or if you work for somebody that is that. So you may not be that type I, is what I call it in the book, but you work for, you're married to, you work with people, it could be helpful. Donnie, maybe you can give some feedback, mostly positive, I hope, Donnie, as you read through that. If it's not, then I'll just mute you. Anything that you would encourage or that you pulled out of it?
Yeah, as a non-type I, it gives good handles too on like, hey, if your person is feeling these feelings, how to have the conversation with them as well. Because and what leeway to give them, and then how to rein them back in whenever they need that reining in. the big part was that like sometimes they need the free chain to be able to run with it too. And so yeah, it was really good. It was eye opening for the people that I work with that are that way, and then also with a type I that I live with on how to handle that at home as well. So yeah,
Love it.
Lee, maybe you can just share a little bit about what the type I is.
Yeah, so it really came out of conversations. It's not really a personality type. So I know that there's all that out there, right? There's Enneagram, there's Strength Finders. Kay is well trained in Working Genius. He just did it with a team yesterday, and those things are all good. Those are great. This is not that, so it's not designed to replace any of that. It really is across those types. There are people, and I use I words, so that's literally where it comes from. It's the idea of like these are the people that are that inspire people. Typically, they're kind of inventive, but they're also impulsive and they can be irritating. So it's that harmony of those things. And so the idea of creating this type I wiring, and what is that, and how do we not, to use Donnie's words, how do we not chain that up, but how do we actually move forward and allow that to run free? But also for the type I person, I think in the book, my goal was to give some healthy encouragement, but also guardrails and boundaries that are reminders for us as far as how we need to operate. I think there's a lot of leaders that are probably wired this way on your team, and you may have some younger leaders that you're trying to kind of empower, and they're kind of wired this way. And so it could be helpful for them to navigate themselves without feeling like they've got to transform, you know. Didn't really know how to close it. I actually wrote most of it and didn't know how to close it. And I was reading the first part of Acts in chapter 1 of Acts, when they come together, disciples, and they're trying to figure out what's next because they've got this great commission, and then Jesus leaves. And then in the NIV, this part stood out to me. It said, "Then Peter stood up." And I thought, oh, that's interesting, right? And then in chapter 2, at the day of Pentecost, everybody's watching these guys, Holy Spirit falls, and it says the same exact thing. It says, "And then Peter stood up." And I thought, what an interesting journey from the shores of Galilee to Jesus saying, "Follow me," all the way to where now he's ready to stand up. He wouldn't have been ready unless he went through that 3-year journey and learned what that type I was. I mean, it speaks to me as somebody who needs to navigate that all the time in my own life. So I hope it could be helpful for you guys. I think there's actually go ahead.
Yeah, it's just going to be a great tool. And that's the thing I would encourage all of us to. It's, when we're meeting with these guys, it's like one of our churches, they do this thing called radical mentoring, where they're guys, those high capacity people in the church. It's just a great tool for that conversation that will help invite those people in to live and lead loud and large. So just keep that in mind. But
yep. Anything else on that? We'll move on. Good.
Pathways and pipelines.
We good? Kay, do you want to go? Kay, do you want to go directly to some of these pressure points? We want to skip this next, or we want to go through this a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, basically, this was a conversation that you ended with at the last Think Tank call. And so maybe you can just kind of bookend that.
Fill it in. Yeah, last time we were on, if you were on in June or you watched it afterwards, we started to have this conversation and then we ran out of time. And so I wanted to come back to it a little bit because I felt like there was maybe something here. This is probably a pressure point for a lot of you. So we'll kind of preemptive the pressure point conversation around this. What you're seeing on screen is our Grow Momentum Church on Mission. You might have a different model that you use as far as discipleship and what are the ways in which we're trying to move people to engagement. But we basically biblically encourage you to put them into these 5 categories as far as what this looks like, what's biblical discipleship look like. But as a part of that, we always talk about this pathway here at the top being an essential element of that. And we use the terms pathways and pipelines. It's important that you guys get the distinction. Most of you are running something like this, but the pathway is defined that way because we believe it's more invitational than and less aggressive potentially than the pipelines. The pipelines are based on someone has already made a step towards engagement, which we'll talk about here in a moment. And so that's the differentiating. It's not just semantics. It's the pathway is how do we invite? How do we invite? How do we invite? The pipelines are how do we shove a little? How do we push a little? So that's the distinction of that. And the pathway is really designed for the individual that is new to our community and new to faith in Christ. So these are those 5 elements, but we want to focus for just a second on the pathway conversation. There they are. Okay, so this is an example of that sort of zoomed in on. You guys should be able to see that on your screen. You've probably seen this before. I want to talk about 2 things. One is the influence zone, and then those 3 elements at the bottom. But what we would say, we've said this to you guys for years, and some of you guys that work with us on a weekly basis, you're just like, Sharon's like, oh my gosh, but we got to constantly scrub this, because what's happening is that a lot of us are seeing an influx of guests, but we're wondering where is the growth from that, right? So it's like in the business world, we would say these are hot, warm, or even hot leads. And sometimes we get pretty frustrated with those on the other end, because they're like, we're not growing, or we're growing slower than we want. And then when you look at it, you start to have a conversation around what is going on with those who are already coming through the front door. So we did a little bit of and some of you guys saw this last month. I apologize if you didn't jump off, but we did a scrub here at the Crossing, where I'm at every day, of our Connect guest cards. So this might be interesting to some of you that weren't here, and then we can talk a little more about it. Basically, over the course of the year, these were digital Connect cards where somebody indicated they were a guest. This is not data ads, if you know what I'm talking about, where they're coming in from other places. This is literally they're digitally raising their hand and saying, I'm here for the first time. And so that was the breakdown of those. And then this is how it worked out, is the percentage of individuals and how they said they actually found us. So you can see on here that 43% of them said someone invited me, which was like pretty encouraging for us to go, okay, as a culture that wants to start people on the pathway through the gathering, we would love for half of the people who are guests to say somebody invited me. So I think Rob can comment on this in a minute, because he did this exercise after the call, but it's interesting to see where that came from. Then we see that 17% came from website, internet, Google search, all that SEO stuff. And we were encouraged by that too, but also felt like maybe there's some opportunity there. 12% came from they drove by one of our buildings and saw a sign or whatever. And then the other interesting part that we found was only 4%, 3.8% said that they came and discovered us via social media. And that was a little surprising to us. Yeah, that was a little surprising, because I think we all sort of feel like social media is like driving guests. Maybe it is for you, so unmute, but this is the only data we have that kind of says, man, an extremely small percentage of our people come for the first time, and they self say the social is there. So here's how this looks for us when we look at our communication, is like, what are the ways in which people come? And so we feel like we use the terms primary, secondary or indirect, and then tactical. And so it kind of looks like this as far as what we believe. We believe that primarily we need to lean into people through person to person, through the internet, leaning into however we can accelerate people finding us when they Google search. And then the third way is some kind of a physical presence. Some of you that don't have buildings or you don't have signage, obviously the drive-by thing is difficult for you. Like we have a church here, a church plant. If you're a church plant, you're in a mobile setting, it's really hard, right? You may not have permanent signage, but you have that. And then indirectly, we believe is our online church and our social media. So we're moving our social media strategy to be even largely more geared at stickiness or engagement, because we believe that people may invite their friend and point them to social media, or point them to our online broadcast as an indirect means of them then engaging with us, but not as a primary, not as the first touch. We believe that most of the time, online and social is a first touch. And then there's some other stuff around some mailings and some tactical stuff like that that we're using. Any questions on that or thoughts on that? This is just our discovery. I'd be curious what you guys have said. Caleb, I would say yes. I think that's what we discovered. We may have some people on our team that were doing some real intentional stuff around funding for internet searches, but none of us were really aware of it. So the 17% was kind of surprising because we're not really trying. And so it sort of said, maybe we should try. Maybe we should be a little bit more intentional around that. Especially being in Vegas, it's potentially, because of the transient nature, there may be the sense that more people are going, looking for a church or whatever. Rob, what'd you find?
Well, the biggest thing, Lee, as you know, was like I just looked into our process, which I thought was pretty dialed in until I looked into it and realized then we asked people how they heard about our church. We just had a blank and you could just fill in the blank. And I'm like, oh no. So when our connections pastor tried to get all the data, a lot of people don't just fill in a blank. And so we changed it all. And for check boxes of did a friend invite you? Did you drive by? Because obviously half of the responses or more were blank. And so we don't know anything. So that was for us like an aha, like, oh crap, I didn't know that was that way in our process. And so, yeah. And then also for us, we're in a semi-permanent place where we rent from an old church, their campus all week long. But seeing yours, like how many people drove by and said that they went to the crossing, it made me kind of move up the priority list, are asking the trustees of the church if we can put a permanent sign out there all week long. And so we're in process of asking for that. So it was very helpful.
It sounds kind of silly, right? It sounds kind of like put a sign, but in Rob's case, it's been a big deal that maybe he moved a little slower on because he is on a reasonably heavy traffic count street.
Very
and so
heavy.
it means that it probably needs to be a higher priority. So where you guys are dumping money into social, I'm not telling you to change your strategy. I just think you might want to run some data on the back end because all the money you're dumping into social thinking that you're going to necessarily see people come. There may be, Kay was putting on there some stuff and I'll let maybe him speak to that. There may be some other places you need to invest that if you're looking to actually attract people that aren't there yet.
So I was going to jump in as well. So I think one of the things we're seeing is again, the one-on-one people inviting. But I think from a social media side, what we're seeing is that the social media is more kind of the keep is what people are using social media for is the engagement once they've kind of been connected to the church. And then they utilize that to invite people to things. And right. I think that when we've kind of followed up, we're seeing that when that person fills out the card, they're actually more looking at it of, oh no, I didn't get invited through social media. I got invited from someone and social media was just a vehicle they used to invite them.
Correct. Yep. That's right. And we got rid of the other, by the way. I didn't mention that. That was the other learning. I don't know who put that on there. They got fired, so it's too bad for them. But the other, there was like 19, 20% that were other, and that doesn't help us at all because there was no way of them telling us what other was. So that's no longer there for us. Anybody else want to comment on that? I'd love for you guys to go back and share with us in the future what you guys discover from that. A couple of things I would say, and Kay may jump in on this too, is number one, if you can't get this data, to Rob's point, that needs to change before this fall. Like if you cannot access this data, then you're just guessing. Like, man, and it happens to us all the time when we do like an SMP, we'll go into a church and we'll say like, hey, how's your front door? And they'll be like, oh, our front door is great. It's like, how do you know? I don't know. I met 2 people last week in the lobby. It's like, no, like we got there. Yes, those things are important, kind of that intuitive like narrative, but the data is there, you guys. And so if you can take that next level without getting too nuts to find out, like when you say your invite culture is healthy, this actually would tell you whether that's truly the case or not, right? If based on this percentage. Kay, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, even going back to the, let's say, for example, the pathway and pipelines, the way that we think of it, your pathway is actually your front door, your pipelines is actually your back door. That's why this is so important, right? And so growth actually happens, as we've talked about in a different call, growth actually happens when you have a wide front door and also a small back door, not a closed back door. You actually want some people to leave, right? But that's why it's an important process to be able to evaluate. And so if your front door, your pathway is not large, then these are the things to be able to measure and to be able to understand how people are coming through. Jeremiah, I think at the last Think Tank Live, you actually shared about your air cover strategy with,
Yeah.
even the pathway around mailings, right? You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I wasn't sure how these headphones work. Yeah, we do it as a way to provide air cover for people to invite their friends. So we're doing another one this fall. We're sending out 90,000 mailers, and it's not going to be the primary way that people show up, but it creates great conversation and buzz in our community, and a community our size, for people to go to their neighbors and their friends and their coworkers and say, yeah, that's the church I go to. You should definitely come and check it out with me. And so they're still doing a personal invite, but it really provides sort of that groundwork. And, we call it the air cover for the soldiers on the ground is kind of the analogy that we've used. So
Love that. Are there
Can
other
I ask
things?
on that one?
Yeah, whoever that is,
Oh,
go for it.
okay. So can I ask on that one? So do you guys have like a call to action on that flyer as well? How do you guys know that the people received it and that was something they're utilizing? I'm just curious.
from people in our community, in our church,
Yeah.
we know that people receive it. We just do a full saturation of a 20-minute drive time. So every address in 20-minute drive time gets the mailer. And then we're actually putting other things into our community's hands several weeks leading up to that to say, here's something you can give to somebody. Here's things you can point them to. And the invite isn't just to our church, because I feel like if somebody isn't interested in church, they don't care that they got invited to a church. The invite on the mailer is specifically to a series that we think will interest a non-church person. So it's not come check out our church. It's, hey, we're going to be talking about this topic specifically. We'd love for you to come and join us for that topic. And that might be interesting. And then the challenge for us at the end of that series would be like, hey, we're hoping that you found this helpful. And if you did, we're doing another series starting next week. Come back and join us for that. So the goal is to turn a first-time guest into a second-time guest, to get them to make it through that series, to get them to join us for another series, just those small steps.
Jeremiah, is it possible that you could add? Go ahead, Kay. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I guess technically you could track if you're doing enough of those mailers. That could be an additional tracking, right? If they were actually invited by one of those mailers, right?
Yeah, for sure.
By something they got in the mail, you could. I think partly you could see what is the effectiveness or the lack of effectiveness of that, by the mailer.
Yeah, we could make that a multiple choice checkbox. That's a great idea.
Yeah, that's where I was going with all of that, and in the sense that, and here's the interesting thing with the social media, finding that you guys found there, Lee. I wondered if, let's say, for example, if somebody actually found it, or actually engaged in the social media of the church and would have potentially checked that, but really it was a friend that shared the social media, and so then they actually put friend instead of social media. And I think it's probably true too, where it's like, okay, they might have got the mailer, but actually they heard about Westbridge from a person, and then it's a double, like, oh, now this has come up 3 times, so I've got an invite, it came through the mailer and I saw it on social media. I better check this thing out, right? And so at the point of all that to say, it's like, when people are actually filling out those surveys, they're going to probably go more towards the person than anything, but it is really good and interesting to be able to see that if there are certain people that are coming primarily through some of those vehicles, it could be fascinating to know.
Yeah. Shane, you had one more question for Jeremiah.
Yeah, well, and I guess this is also just for. So, is anyone else using mailers and things like that? So, I know for Easter, for some of the big holidays, I know sometimes churches use those mailers. And then, what are you, if you are using those, what are the things you guys are, drawing people to? So, what is the call to action? I know there's some churches that are doing, hey, bring this back, and you get a free cup of coffee, and that's kind of they're able to tell how many what their ROI was on. And so I was curious if that's working for anyone. If not, because I think I've kind of heard two sides. I've heard from the political side, people like, oh, I hate these and they never work. But then also on the other side, that you look at the political campaigns and they have such a huge budget for mailers and things that it must be working for them somehow.
I think, and Jeremiah can speak to it, but I'll speak for him because I'm a type I. I think don't forget his air cover thought. I think he begins with an air cover mentality. So it's not necessarily a 1-to-1 or like 5% of these people need to show up. I think he's hoping that the neighbor is going to have the convo with the neighbor who got a mailer and said, oh yeah, I got that mailer. So it's more of a gap than necessarily a direct, I got this mailer and I'm suddenly going to show up. Is that fair, Jeremiah?
Yeah, totally. And what it does is gives us sort of positive brand awareness in the community. So it's really on top of other things that we're already doing. So we're doing a lot of things in the community, Adopt a Highway, and partnering with a lot of local initiatives. And then when they see our brand, and again, it's not an invitation to our church. It's not, hey, our church is cooler than other churches. It's not that at all. It's
you are
topic, not even close. Here's a topic that we think you'll be interested in as somebody who probably doesn't even go to church. You may not even come back after this series, but why not give us a shot for these 3 weeks when we talk about marriage or we talk about parenting, because we think there's some things that can really help you. And then on those mailers, that's really the call to action. It's not to come to our church, it's to come specifically to this series. And then we'll typically always put a QR code on there that takes them directly to a video that's like me introducing that series and just saying, hey, even if you're not a church person, we just know like you're probably a parent, or if you're married, or whatever the topic is. And we'd love to help you in those areas. So come and check it out as we have these conversations together. And so the call to action is really just to show up and investigate. It's not to come and join our church. And it's providing that air cover. So,
well, and the thing about Jeremiah too, you're intentional at what it is. So like tying in with what Lee's talking about here, the primary versus indirect, like you understand it's the air cover, but you're being intentional. I'm in Pasadena. I know for some people, I forget who asked the question there. I know Rob, I think Shane, you did. I'm in Pasadena where I do know mailers work here, but I know other people might articulate mailers don't work in their community. And I think having those touch points of learning what's working is huge, because it might work in your community versus not in someone else. But as long as you're intentional at what you're trying to accomplish with the primary versus indirect, I think it's helpful to be aware of that.
Can I add one thing, Lee?
Yeah, go for it, man. Love it. No,
am I in exile or no?
Chris Hall.
Yeah, remember me? Yeah. One thing that we've been way more intentional when it comes to that marketing or that air cover is a little bit more strategic. Our database of addresses within Planning Center is in the thousands, but we do not have thousands on Sunday. And so we send postcard mailers that announce series, events, all that kind of stuff. And 4 or 5 times a year, and it costs us hundreds of dollars and not thousands of dollars. And we market to people who have already visited us, but may not be coming regularly at all. So that's a different way of thinking of air cover, because we're going after the customers that have already tried us out and going, hey, we're still here. We think we're thinking about you. And we do it that way. And it's similar to what you're doing there, Jeremiah, but for us, a little more budget friendly and allows us to accomplish something very similar.
We do the exact same thing for every series. We do an internal postcard to everybody in our database. And the thought behind that is this: I hate when I go to the dentist and they shame me for how long it's been since I've been to the dentist. It's like the worst feeling ever. So they're like, oh, it's been a while since you've been here. Like, yeah, I know. That's why I'm here. And so we, on every postcard that we send out, it'll be like, hey, there's a new series, just thinking about you. And then we'll always include the language that says, we promise no guilt, no shame, no matter how long it's been. And we just want you to know, like, whenever you decide to re-engage with us, here's the next thing. We just want to stay on your radar. Here's the next thing coming up. Here's the next thing coming up. And you're right, it costs us. We just sent one out for a series starting next week, and it literally cost us $300 to mail to our entire database.
Okay. That's great. The other thing we're doing, if some of you are at scale with multi, so our larger context, we typically aren't doing mailers, but we're starting to leverage them for our two sites. So they're a smaller scale, and they're kind of more neighborhoodish. So we are doing mailers for them, and they're doing a 3 or 4 mile radius around that campus location, and it tends to be pretty effective, especially our one location that's more in the urban setting here in Vegas, more inner, our Midtown. They have had some success, a lot of apartments, things like that, people that are disconnected. It's been pretty effective at that. Kay, do you want to talk about what I put on the screen, and then we'll move to some of the pressure points? Because it kind of came up here a little bit as far as when we target stuff as far as pathway.
Yeah, this is something that we developed years ago where when we talk about the top of the funnel all the way towards the bottom, basically the left side of this, the -5 to the 0 would be the point of actually somebody actually getting connected to your church. And so really in the very beginning, we want some kind of brand exposure. Do they know that we exist, right? So sometimes you'll go into a community. We work with churches where they're in a rural community. Everybody knows they exist. Exposure is not the problem. Endearment is the problem, which is the next step, right? But in other communities, maybe the exposure, like nobody really knows that we exist. I mean, we're kind of hidden in the back, or really there's a lot of churches and we're just one of them. And so the exposure, it's really good to be able to identify, hey, where do we need the most work in, or do we need to put some more effort in? So the exposures, do they know that we exist?
Would you put the postcards in there, Kay, with what Jeremiah is talking about? Would that be there?
I think so, because it's when you receive a postcard, you're not endearing them. Now, when they cross the line and they come to a series and they get a felt need thing, there might be a point of endearment at that point, right? But still, at that point, then they're connected to the church and they're not getting engaged. That endearment really is like what Jeremiah was saying just earlier, what you do in the community, right? Like, so that's how you endear. That's one of an example of how you would endear the community. So do they know that we exist? Do they care that we exist? It's the old question that we've heard a million times. Like, if your church didn't exist tomorrow, would anybody even notice? Type of thing, right? Like, or would they even care? And so that's the endearment part, right? So, do you have more of an exposure capacity or growth point, or endearment growth point? And then once they cross the line and get connected to the church, now it's like, now are they better because we exist? There's the engagement part. And then ultimately, all this should be fed by then the evangelists. Are their friends better because we exist? And so then that should feed into the exposure once again on the other side of things, right? So this is the spectrum that sometimes is helpful for us to be able to say, like, sometimes I'll go into a church and say, okay, hey, of these 4 categories, would you force rank them? What do you think you're the best at? Well, probably engagement. Like, once they're here, man, like they're good. All right. But we're probably the worst in exposure because people don't know really about us. And then the next maybe endearment, because we do a lot in the community, but the worst or best or whatever is evangelist, because it's like, how do we get our people to activate and to really share with their friends? And so to be able to look at it on a spectrum, it could be a really good evaluation tool for your staff to be able to say, okay, red, yellow, green, each one of these, right? Exposure, do you think we're red or do you think we're green? Endearment, engagement, evangelist. So that's the tool.
Love it. I just want to throw that up there for a second. That's great, because I think this will go out in the deck. Some of you have seen it, you've interacted with it. Some of you, it's the first time, or you're being reminded. And the question I would ask, and we're going to move on, is where are we strong and where are we anemic? Where are we strong and where are we anemic? So if you're looking at this, you're going, okay, we're great on the right side, or we have lots of raving fans, but nobody knows, right? So that might be an area as you look at the next 12 months that you want to put some energy around when you think about some objectives for your team. How do we put a 1-year plan in place? If the left side is not thriving and we need to pour some gasoline on that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So just use this as a spectrum. Okay, you want to run through a couple of those? You want to hit some of the pressure points? We're going to pivot to that. I think you kind of grabbed them as a group. Maybe there's one or two that we can knock off quickly.
Well, I think there's a bucket, and the biggest bucket that I see as a common thread is the staffing. So whether it be hiring staff, that's quality staff, whether it's navigating challenges with staff, whether it's evaluating them for effectiveness, What's a good model for that? What's the makeup of that? So I saw a lot of things around staffing. Does anybody want to color that with a case study? Please, just as briefly as
Yeah.
possible, so that it could actually kickstart our conversation around staffing.
There was a lot about full-time, part-time too. So if you're wrestling with that, like how do we that combination as far as rhythms? Anybody? Peterson, you've got it all figured out.
Kay, I'll just say this, that in the past we've made a lot of hiring mistakes. So you really helped us in this process that we're in actually come up with a hiring process that we can repeat over and over again. And thinking like that has really been helpful.
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing about hiring is that many times like we have our 4Cs and we have our frameworks to be able to evaluate certain things. But it seems like when I'm looking at churches, it seems like they reinvent the wheel every single time versus like, all right, what can we do to be able to have a larger framework that we would actually collapse that's, because this is a lower entry position that we can, go a little bit faster or expand because, this is something that's the most important hire of the organization type of thing. And so that's something that I would encourage from a process perspective to be able to say, okay, hey, how can you actually dial in a system so that way then one of the biggest questions, if you've ever been a candidate, one of the biggest questions, where am I in the process? And you feel so blinded by that. And to be frankly honest, it's because the church really doesn't know their process that you as a candidate didn't know where you were in the process, right? And so this is where it's like, if you can have a more system. So, and what you're doing in that is, of course, making sure that you're shoring all the different things that you need to be able to do that. I'll just give one tip because and this comes from my experience, even from Slingshot and doing a lot of hires through that way. That a process that I used to use there, and that is that there's certain schools of thoughts that says, hey, every interview should be the same for all candidates. And then others would say, actually, it should be different for each one. And this is what I would say. I say you start the best effective best practice that I've seen around this. You start with a commonplace where you have very similar questions that you start with all candidates all at the same time. And then you actually identify the yellow flags and the red flags of each one of those candidates. And then the next preceding interviews, you actually then start zeroing in on those things through different ways, whether it be through references, whether it be through different. Now, again, that doesn't sound like rocket science. And yet at the same time, what I hear from candidates all the time is literally, it's like, I told the same thing to a different person every single time. And they ask the same questions to a different, like, okay, now I met with the elders and they asked the same questions. I met with the staff and they asked the same questions. And literally, you're asking the same questions and you're going to get the same results versus tackling it at different, ways. So all that to say, hiring is something there. Is there anything else that you guys were wondering or had a pain point around staffing that we could talk about?
How are you
You guys
guys
put these in here, so come on.
Yeah, how are you guys navigating your rhythm of meetings, et cetera, with the part-time realities that we're in now, right? So is anyone feeling like they've nailed some of that, or maybe you can be a little more specific around like, if part-timers can't be at meetings, how are you navigating all of that, the virtual aspects of things? What are people finding as far as a flow of keeping your staff on the same page? Everybody's like, I'm not finding it.
I mean, I can jump in because I did ask about the part-time, full-time. Yeah, sorry, no cigar right now. But our main issue, I mean, we're an anomaly sort of church in the sense that we absorbed another church and their staff and didn't change a thing, which I wouldn't recommend. But the necessity of taking on a huge debt was to bring on more part-time and kind of transition some full-time people out. And so if I have to hear one more staff person ask for clarity on issues and communication flows, we've tried to do everything we can, but trying to get all of your part-time people and reminding people, hey, our graphics person, she's part-time, like 2 days a week. So she's not going to respond to you ASAP if you need a graphic. So we've put in a lot of processes then where the full-time people, we just require more of them to do a lot of planning basically 6 months out for events that they're going to do, have a workflow of I need a graphic by this day, so I need to communicate with her by this day, 3 months out if I need a graphic, that sort of thing. And that's been our best practice we've done. It's not been perfect, but our number one issue has been trying to convince the lead pastor who loves people and loves everyone to be in the room at the same time together and to join in fun that hey, you can't require all the part-time people to be here. And that's been probably the bigger issue, and even with the staff, because sometimes there's just some morale of like, oh, there aren't as many people as there used to be. It's like, well, they are, but they're here at this time, or they're here on Tuesday nights at 7:00 because that's when they can get in to get work done. So I don't know if that did anything.
Oh, it's helpful. I think what I was listening to, Caleb, I'm thinking part of where we probably have to get better as executive level leaders, and it may not be that exciting for all of us, but I think we've got to pay attention to it, is how are we navigating and leveraging all of the tools that are out there, right? So face-to-face meetings are a tool. That is a tool that we use to make decisions, to execute things. But I think we have to understand, with the difference of staffing now, even generational differences, that the meeting tool has to be used very strategically. And then there are other tools that can be used or can be put in. I'm not just talking about tech. I mean, the ways we communicate, how are we communicating, the rhythm of communication that can keep everybody aligned, which is really what we're talking about, right? Is the idea of like alignment can get really funky really quick because we're not all sitting in the same 5 offices with a conference room that we go into 6 times a day, right? And what Caleb mentioned is potentially a little more of I'll be careful here, old school leadership style may think that that's the way we do things, right? As we all get in the same room. And so there's probably a little bit of proving that we're going to have to use with some of the tools that are available to us or that we can create to head that off. Anybody else want to comment on that? I'm trying to group think here a little bit.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think you're absolutely right about using the tools you have. One of the things that we do is we actually have our process. Essentially, at the very end of every meeting, we have what's our messages, and so those are the things we've kind of written down of going, all right, what do we need to cascade down to our part-time staff, things like that as well. And so that's kind of just built into the process of making sure that we have a process in place so that things don't fall through the cracks.
Yeah. Like we've heard me mention on here, at our school, we do something called a what up every week. Don't laugh, but literally it was created because I said no one knows what's up. And so they created a document that goes out massively through our Google Drive and Slack every Wednesday afternoon that sort of covers the weekend. Here's what's up. Here's what's being talked about. Here's who's doing what at multiple locations. Again, it's not for the people like you that already know what's up. The problem is most of us on this call know what's up. It's us creating tools that will actually speak to those who are not in all of those conversations. And sometimes those tools are going to feel a little frivolous to us, but for the people that are the information that maybe they're at the, I'm going to say lower, they're at the end of the line of that information. Some of the basic stuff where you put it all and it lives all in one place is going to be extremely helpful. And some of the technology now with Slack and some of the channeling that can be done there can help keep people connected. So we use a what up tool every week. I glance at it because I mostly know what's going on, but man, there are people who live and die by that thing. I know that because when it doesn't go out at the right timing, we hear about it. So they're waiting on it. So, and if any of you guys are multi-siting, which, a lot of you are or will be, stuff like that becomes even more and more crucial for that.
The meeting question is an interesting one because basically, it's come up a couple of different ways. Even the part-time, full-time is about meetings and stuff too. And this is the biggest principle that I can share about meetings, that the more and more churches that I see and see their meetings and structures and stuff, this is the principle. The principle is that the more frequent your meetings are, the more in the details you'll be, right? So, or the level of altitude of your meetings is dictated by the frequency of your meetings. Meaning that if you have a weekly meeting, guess what's going to happen? It's going to be a very detailed meeting because you can only really talk about that week, right? It's going to be very, very natural for you to talk about what's happening that week or maybe the next week if you're ahead of the thing. But if you want, like, one of the things that we do find out is that, yes, I mean, we're big fans of meetings. At the same time, we do see a lot of meetings that are unnecessary. And if you actually want those meetings to zoom out a little bit more, then maybe you do it less frequently. Maybe you do it every other week instead of every week. Maybe you start batching things up a little bit differently. And so those are the things that I would recommend, because I mean, again, there's nothing like a meeting to be able to get everything synced and aligned and stuff. But we also know that at the minute that they leave the meeting, they're out of sync and misalignment happens. You've heard that from us too. And so we can't just rely on the meetings to be able to do that. Using tools like 15Five to be able to stay in sync all throughout, versus actually using one-on-one meetings to be able to do that. So the one prime example is your elder meetings. If you're leading elder meetings, if you're worried that the elders are getting too much into the details, and you tell me that you're meeting on a monthly basis or even every other week, as some of you guys are doing, it's like, no wonder they're in the details, right? And so if you want them to actually get out of the details, then maybe move the frequency, have them zoom out by actually meeting a little bit less. And so there's lots of churches that meet on a quarterly basis or every other month basis for board meetings. And then it forces them to basically say, okay, hey, we got to focus on the bigger picture things versus like looking at what happened spending wise this month. So all that to say, that's a thought on the meetings.
Hey, in February's think tank call, I mean, all of you guys get the review email after today where you'll get the deck. You get it. But in February, we interviewed two of our guys on here, Mike Frisch and Steve Owens. And at the end of the call, one of the things that a lot of people focused on was the meetings, like how to effectively run meetings. So in that slide deck from February, there's some tools and examples of how to run effective meetings. So don't be afraid to go back and grab that slide deck and use that to some of this conversation, because I think that's a great resource that might answer some of the questions you might be asking today as well.
Love that. Look at you, Jeff, going back. Look at you. You redeemed yourself.
So, Kay, I was going to ask, so with that, as you were talking about the frequency, things like that. So I know that I've been a part of churches that have done, almost like a quarterly all staff meeting where it's a little more vision, mission, things like that. And then I've been a part of other ones that are, maybe every other month where it's just kind of high level things. And we had food, things like that, and it was the all staff. Are you seeing that happen at quite a few different churches, or is that kind of more the outlier?
Well, I'll close us off with this, Shane. Thank you for the segue. One of the things that those of you guys that have done our S&P process, one of the things on our dashboard that we give you as a part of that is the choice of either a quarterly or a trimester process of consistently going in and having those setting the next quarter or the next trimester's objectives, the 5 or 6, whether you call them wigs, we use rocks, etc. And so we believe that either quarterly or on a trimester basis, every 4 months, there should definitely be a focused, longer, extended, whether it has to be a full day, but more than a 60-minute conversation. And we believe if you do that meeting well, and you set those actually ahead of time so we know, and you get the right people in the room, we would advocate that would actually probably eliminate, if not some meetings, it would definitely eliminate some of the weediness of the meetings that you still have. If you're not doing those quarterly or trimester resets, you're probably doing it on the fly on a regular weekly basis in the room. Hey, you do this, you do that. And so it ends up bogging you down versus carving out the time, setting it. And so when we leave our SMPs, we're like, okay, let's go. And so we're setting it, and every church kind of finds their own rhythm with that. But we know that the ones that have successfully instituted that have started to, over time, they start to see some momentum from that. We got to jump off because we want to respect your time. We'll take these pressure points. We'll actually probably take and use down the road, maybe even pull in some outside guests to come and speak to some of those. So we apologize. Some of these are big topics. All right, you guys. And so as a reminder, this email, the deck and the recording from this will go out sometime later today or early tomorrow. And we hope to see you guys. We'll have another call in August, another in September, but get yourself signed up for the think tank. We really want to see you guys. All right. Thanks for being here, you guys.